I would want to ask the question, hey, rounding people up and putting them in camps, wherever did you get that idea?
So yeah, a little bit further on that note, you make the argument that political violence is the primary driving force of the great homogenization.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that comes through in the kind of world that you've been describing over the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. So you make this argument around political violence being the primary driver of the great homogenization rather than traditional or Marxist approaches to imperialism.
Yeah.
Why this emphasis on political violence rather than, say, capitalism or even the optimizing drives of technological evolution? I think you've been speaking to this question already. But just to tilt your attention a little bit more toward war, which is so central to your project, why is it crucial to think about war as a form of life within the great homogenization? And what is a Marshall ecology of the Eurocene?
Yeah, this one's just straight stolen from one of my advisors, Daniel Dudney, which is that I replaced modes of production with modes of destruction. And there's a reason for that. So there's a historical reason, which is that I don't actually think that proto-capitalism explains the first 100 years of settler colonialism that are pre-capitalist. I think you have to have a better explanation for that, in part because it was such a disaster. It was not in any way useful. It was exuberant, but it wasn't useful, right? We didn't find the gold we were looking for. We didn't produce crops like we'd hoped. The first 100 years of settler colonialism were mostly people freezing to death and eating each other. And they still kept coming back for more. And that's interesting, right? It's interesting that settler colonialism worked as a mode of production before it worked as a mode of production for capital. So that's sort of point one. And that'll become interesting in a second when I get to point three.
Jairus, I'm sorry. Just explain that.
Yeah.
Settler colonialism became a mode of production.
Yeah.
In what sense are you differentiating these two different modes, one of capital, one of settler?
Yeah, because it couldn't produce value, right? It was just a total value suck, but it reproduced itself. So one of the things I think is really important about mode of production as a concept is that it's a way for Marx to do early complexity theory before he had a lot of the concepts for it, which is that he needs something like what Simon Dohm would call a logic of individuation, meaning how could something become fundamental and not be articulated, whereby social relations and political relations and relations of war will reproduce themselves over and over and over again without having to have central organization, right? Like for me, that's the power of mode of production. It gives us an explanatory tool for understanding the reproduction of order. But one of the central drivers, right, because there's all these forces, right, it's an energetic system for Marx, is the production of value, right? So you need it because if capitalism can't produce value in the form of profit, right, from surplus, right, value from labor, then there's nothing to reinvest in the system to explain it being expansionist, right? Then it should actually almost be equilibrium-like rather than having this massive, explosive, creative character. It should just sort of hold still. And the interesting thing is it was explosive and exuberant before, and in fact for almost a century, before it ever figured out how to produce value. And that to me is really interesting. And I don't think that I think people have worked really hard at trying to explain this. So you look at particularly a lot of the longue durée Marxists, right? They try to give an account of mercantilism and also like the state form as being an early driver to that. But what's remarkable is you get up close and you look at the kinds of people who wanted to flourish in the new world, and they weren't state driven in that way. They weren't even necessarily that driven by riches. They were, not to be overly Nietzschean about it, but they just loved killing people and telling them what to do. I've read their diaries and I reproduced some of the diaries in the book, but there's an exuberance in the sadism of settler colonialism. And so I'm trying to draw attention, and that's why I said point one relates to point three, but now I'm going to skip point two and come back to it in a minute, which is that I think that you can have a political economy of sadism which is not a capitalist economy, meaning you can have techniques of capitalism, you can have productive forces of capitalism without having to be as dependent upon value from labor as Marx would have. And so that's because I like take a healthy dose of Bataille and dump him back into Marx. And I can imagine, right, potlatch economies, and the potlatch is torment, right, is torture. And so like, I don't need just capital to explain people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. I also need this other economy of desire, which is a political economy, but it is not the political economy of capital. Entirely.
So sorry. So
yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I mean, I can imagine responses to this, which would be,
Sure.
you know, Europe was still transitioning from feudalism to capitalism in the 16th century.
Sure.
So the primitive accumulation, the forms of violence that were taking place during that century were the foundation for the development of capitalism itself, and also for the emergent world order that capital creates.
Yeah.
But
there's almost no primitive accumulation in that first 100 years.
Okay, explain that, and because I can only imagine that Marxists would be like, well, it's violence was always there from the beginning. So you're differentiating two things that shouldn't actually be differentiated.
So for Marxists, though, the violence is only a means to the accumulation. It's not the ends. And for me, I think what they were accumulating was sadism. They were accumulating violence. And eventually, accumulating violence produced the accumulation of wealth, right? Property, raw materials. But for the entire period of the Little Ice Age, it did exactly the opposite. At best, during the first 40 years of the Little Ice Age, all it did is provide a pressure valve, a relief from Europe, from the people who were fleeing the fact that agriculture was collapsing in Europe as well because of the Little Ice Age. So productivity levels during that sort of late neo-feudal European period were no longer able to produce surplus. And so you have political unrest, and you have like starvation, and then you have a bunch of people who are willing to get on boats thinking there's going to be a better life. But the reality is that most of the people pushing them onto the boats, like, they just like doing it. And so, you know, I think that there is something strangely de-eroticizing, in the same way that in Marxism we often mean depoliticizing, from understanding primitive accumulation as merely having that rational ends, whereby violence was just the most efficient means of taking value from something else, because there was no value taken. Most of the people didn't come back with gold. Most of the people couldn't even hold on to property. There weren't a bunch of resources waiting for them, and they just kept it up. And they kept it up for a very, very long time before there was anything like accumulation. And that seems a little strange for me. I don't think that there's an easy Marxist explanation for that, other than, you know, like where we normally understand the desire for profit through alienation, and, you know, kind of like the more subjectivity-based arguments that we can extract from Marx. But I don't think that's enough. And I also think there's a reason for amplifying that in particular. Given, I think we're entering into another stage very similar to that in outer space, and in the ways of trying to extract value from things like bioprospecting and the kind of production of new forms of life, and in, you know, longevity, and these other ways where it has to be retrofit to capital, because that's the way that they're producing the resources to do it. But capital is not its only motivation by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, quite the opposite. So that's sort of part one. Part two is Marxists very rarely understand the logics of martial economies as well as they understand the logics of civilian economies. And they try to bifurcate them. And these were all martial economies. And, you know, I mean, I make a quip in the book that, you know, everybody wants to talk about double entry bookkeeping because that's the only way you can measure profit and you can create interest and, you know, do the things that we think of as being the inheritance of modern capital. But, you know, for me, the reality is, you know, this is like puts me on the slightly more Heideggerian side, you know, and why I like Marcuse probably. But, you know, I think interchangeable parts. I think homogenization, the capacity to mobilize labor in ways where skill, artisanship is not significant, is actually the driving force, right? And so Marx sees that as an effect of the desire to produce capital, not what makes capital possible. And it's not outside for me, the realm of possibility that we missed entirely that all the early factories only made one thing. They made guns. The first patent for movable parts was for the rifle. And in fact, the desire to create patents in the Americas, because that's where they were invented, was to protect the first rifle as being something that could bring a certain kind of proprietary claim to the rifle maker, and was set up as the first thing that was mass produced. So, war has a very different relationship to value. And, there are some people who obviously dove into this. I don't end up in the same place, but this is part of Schumpeter's argument about creative destruction, which becomes really important to 20th century Marxists. But I think it's more than that. So creative destruction can fully be articulated within a Marxist worldview if we understand it as only this kind of process of expanding markets or building new markets, or trying to get rid of the kind of recalcitrance of labor forms. But what it doesn't explain is that there are a lot of people who fight wars to fight wars. They actually like the thrill of war. And so for me, particularly with the rise of state fascism, but also the recurrence of militarized fascism that doesn't always have to have a state form, we have to understand war as a distinct logic from logics of economy. And that gets back to the kind of Bataille, desire for expenditure that doesn't make sense in some sense purely within a Marxist form. And strangely, what it's most akin to is what labor looks like after capital. So martial labor, particularly when it's just fully unleashed, looks a lot like Marx's labor when we've overcome the alienation from the capital form, where it's just unbounded, right? It's just this sort of pure desire, which meets itself in the kind of homo faber, species being. That's how a lot of people feel about war, right? The first time you put an M16 in their hand, they're just like, God, I've been waiting for this my whole life. And those are some of the people I'm studying in the book, are these people who, even when wars are over, the first thing they do is figure out how to get paid to do it. And they're like, oh, we'll get paid. Well, then that's just labor. But what's remarkable is when you study a lot of these private military corporations, they run at a loss. A lot of them will do it to lose money just to get back to the fight, right? Like they're not doing war to make money. They're trying to get money so they can do war. And I think that has to be understood as being distinctive as a way of organizing politics. And I think we have lots of historical examples where we've seen that take place. And this is, again, I think part of the reticence versus the way that Marxism entered in international relations. Marxist IR people were just as willing to accept deterrence theory within the nuclear paradigm as the sort of capitalist, state form. And the reason why is because they thought that they were both fundamentally rational, right? They believed in rationality as a kind of ordering principle. And the problem is, you actually go look at the people who built these weapons, and they were psyched that they were going to get used. They thought that it might jumpstart human evolution. There were a lot of people in the United States that were excited that the Russians were going to strike counter-value targets because those were all cities rather than military. And the US could, in the words of the president of Harvard at the time, James Conant, it would be a kind of win-win, where because of white flight and because of the unsuccess of busing, that in a nuclear war, Russia would lose its intellectual centers and the United States would just lose its black population. And then that would, that the future, according to him, were in new cities like Bakersfield, California, and these other small 10 to 60,000 person cities that had been created precisely fleeing the race riots of the 60s. That's not a capitalist logic. It's embedded in capitalism and it uses capitalism to reproduce itself, but like that kind of accelerationist drive to recreate humanity and whiteness and go to the stars and do it with atom bombs, like for me that's weird enough to explain differently. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
So a mode of destruction. So I would like to ask one more question here on this because I would find it interesting. So you're describing you're describing a number of different things, but a Marshall ecology has to take into consideration, obviously you're not satisfied with some sort of Marxist reduction to capital and that specific production of value or even forms of labor. You're looking at sort of economies of emotional economies, economies of desire, as you said, like economies of sadism,
Yeah.
The production of sadism. How does the Marshall ecology that we are sort of, I don't know, there's a lot of people who want to talk about this moment, this historical moment as one of sort of transition from, high neoliberalism of like, the late 90s and early 2000s moving into some other sort of political economic dispensation. And obviously climate change, all the attendant sort of intensities that are associated with that are a part of this. What I'm trying to get at here is how are these dynamics of a Marshall ecology sort of changing and shifting and modulating at this moment? And where do you sort of see them headed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will actually, it's already all about my book, so I shouldn't give shout outs to more things, but I just wrote this piece called From Geopolitics to Geotechnics for the Journal of International Relations. And I talked a little bit about what those futures could look like. So people could check that out if they wanted to. The short answer is this, like, I'm obviously indebted to Marxism, right? There is no better account of the transformation of political economy, full stop, right? It's super cool. There's all kinds of useful things. However, for the same reason that I think that there were modes of destruction that predate the mode of production of capital, I think we can also see the emergence of modes of destruction taking over again. And I think these are, and I say this in the article, very much in parallel to the way that somebody like Asho Bembe talks about necropolitics as being distinctive from biopolitics. So for me, biopolitics is really at home in capital and is mostly at home in late stage neoliberalism, but is not exactly at home in some interesting phenomena that are happening. So I'll give it just an example, which maybe is better than trying to explain all of it. So if you're a good like neoclassical economist, or you're a good Marxist, then the automation of labor doesn't scare you too much. And one of the reasons is because Jeffrey Sachs will basically make the Marxist argument, in fact he did, that the automation of labor hits a wall and a limit because wages are the only way that we know how to rationally redistribute wealth. And as a result, you won't be able to produce the consumer power necessary to sustain capitalism if you automate too much, right? So in a certain sense, like, don't freak out, there's a net. And the Marxists will say the same thing, right? They'll say that like ultimately capitalism can't live without labor because, and Marx makes this argument about machines, but people have updated it, right? You can't get surplus value, labor value from machines because, all these very different reasons, which have a lot to do with machines degrading and not being able to reproduce themselves. And but by the way, if they start reproducing themselves, that already gets
declining rate of profit.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's more than the standard declining rate of profit argument, right? It's actually that like machines have a faster declining rate of profit because of the nature, and also part of the conceit of that argument, like if you go to the footnote in the abstract on machines, one of the things he says is because who are you going to pay to fix them? Is one of the sort of like warrants for the claim he makes, and the answer is, well, you're not. You're going to have machines fix machines, right? So he doesn't think through the generative capability of algorithmic machine learning as a capacity for machines to reproduce themselves. So that's sort of part one. And that's underdeveloped. But there's still the sort of Sachs-Marx argument, right? Which is that, well, what are you going to, like, who's going to buy the stuff? Why would you bother? And that's where I think the kind of Marshall ecology comes in. If there are other ways of producing value, which are not premised on consumer value, or rather consumer demand, like getting to Mars, like making people live forever, or like tormenting people in other countries because it's an interesting thing to do, right? These kinds of the productions of sadistic value, which are another version of surplus value, but they're produced through pain or through killing or through abandonment or through clearing, right? Like literally just emptying spaces out. Or turning them into things, right? The possibility of human bodies having value in their substance rather than in their labor, which is, I think, particularly terrifying, but not impossible. And something that indigenous people are already experiencing with bioprospecting, right? Where their genetic diversity is more significant than their labor power. And so how we'll come to understand their bodies is something we can archive as opposed to something we have to keep alive. That's a good example of a kind of transformation in the relationship between a body and labor power, which can happen if capitalism is a form that's incredibly powerful, but it's not a law. And I think that's the difference. So it's not that I'm contra Marx, it's just that I'm contra the sort of totality of capitalism and its other in terms of where value comes from. And part of that too is also a bit of unease with the way that species being works in Marx, which plenty of Marxists have cleaned up, but they've cleaned it up in a way which I think still is open to this problem, which is there may not be a net with automation. We may not care, right, that there's no way to generate profit from these things. And you read the kind of apocalyptic texts that people like Thiel and other right-wing accelerationists read and talk about, and they're kind of okay with just the massive catastrophe of the economy and like leaving this planet behind and leaving it in ruins, and even toying with it, experimenting with it. And that's also sort of related to the next book, which is, I think experimentation, like experimentalism, is within the realm of capital for sure right now, but is entering into the martial ecology more significantly and produces value in its experimentation, not because of the use of what the experiment produces. So playing with bodies, altering life, gaining a certain kind of efficacy over plasticity. These things can produce value even if they don't produce profit. And we have to think about what we're going to call that new term, where what we mean by profit is not something that can be reinvested into capital, but is like the residue and scabs of pain and torment, which are in themselves valuable, right? They produce joy for really creepy, people hell-bent on doing these things. And, I wish that were like sci-fi, but like, those are the people who funded Trump's campaign. Thiel funded the last 6 months of Trump's campaign. Those are the people that we're saying can save us from climate change, right? So yeah, so does that help? So yeah, I think it's not that capital is informative. It's also not that capital isn't dominant or hegemonic, but I can already see these other kinds of economies that were there at the beginning of settler colonialism bubbling back up and gaining not autonomy from capital, but semi-autonomy, right? And that semi-autonomy, I think, is really important. One, for where capital gets driven in its late stages, and also what emerges out of it, which, I wish were communism, but